In 1891, Emma Mitchell stepped off the train in Pine Ridge, Colorado, her life's possessions tucked in a weathered trunk and her heart filled with nervous anticipation. The bitter December wind bit through her woolen coat as snowflakes dusted her shoulders. She had traveled over 1,800 miles from Philadelphia to marry a man she'd never met, a man who would take one look at her and decide she wasn't what he wanted. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In an era when women had precious few options, Emma found herself abandoned in a frontier town where her silence was viewed as a defect rather than the consequence of grief. Yet destiny has a curious way of guiding lost souls to where they truly belong. This is the story of how a woman who could barely whisper found her voice in the most unexpected place, with a man who lived in permanent silence. The December snow swirled around Emma Mitchell as she descended from the train at Pine Ridge Station. Her gloved fingers trembled, not just from the cold, but from the uncertainty that lay ahead. Clutched in her hand was a letter, the culmination of 4 months of correspondence with Harold Wilson, a letter that had contained a marriage proposal and a one-way ticket west. At 30 years old, Emma had resigned herself to spinsterhood, back in Philadelphia, until Harold's advertisement in the Matrimonial Gazette had caught her eye. A successful shopkeeper in a growing Colorado settlement, he sought a refined Eastern lady of good character and gentle disposition to bring sophistication to his life and business. The photograph he'd enclosed showed a clean-shaven man with pomaded hair and a confident smile. In her letters, Emma had been honest about everything: her work as a seamstress, her love of poetry, her family's decline in fortune after her father's investments failed, everything except the fact that she spoke in whispers, if at all. The scarlet fever that had ravaged her family 3 years prior had damaged her vocal cords, leaving behind a voice so soft it was often mistaken for silence. A portly man in a fur-trimmed coat approached, consulting a daguerreotype in his gloved hand. "Miss Mitchell," he called out, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Emma nodded, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Harold Wilson was shorter than his photograph suggested, with a receding hairline carefully disguised in his portrait. She hadn't come for romance, though. She'd come for security and the chance to leave behind the pitying glances of Philadelphia society. "Welcome to Pine Ridge," Harold announced, surveying her with increasingly evident disappointment. He made no move to help with her trunk, instead studying her face with growing dissatisfaction. "You appear older than your photograph implied." Emma felt her cheeks burn despite the cold. She opened her mouth to respond, but only a raspy whisper emerged. The journey was exhausting. Harold's eyebrows shot up in alarm. "What's wrong with your voice?" he demanded, leaning closer as if volume might be the problem. She reached into her handbag and withdrew a small slate and chalk, tools that had become extensions of herself. In careful script, she wrote, "Illness affected my voice. I can speak, but with difficulty." Harold read the message, his frown deepening into a scowl. "You made no mention of this impediment in your letters." Emma wrote quickly, "I express myself better in writing. I hope this won't present a problem." "Not a problem," Harold scoffed, his voice rising. "I run a store, Miss Mitchell. I need a wife who can converse with customers, who can represent my business in social circles, not someone who must write everything down like a schoolchild." The curious stares of bystanders burned into Emma as she stood on the platform, humiliation washing over her like the icy wind. 6 days of travel, nearly all her savings spent on appropriate clothes for her new life, and now she faced rejection before even leaving the station. "This simply won't do," Harold declared, stepping back as if her condition might be contagious. "You have misrepresented yourself, Miss Mitchell. The westbound train departs tomorrow morning. I suggest you be on it." Emma's hand shook as she wrote, "I can work. I can assist in other ways." "I advertised for a wife, not a burden," Harold replied coldly. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Emma standing alone beside her trunk as snowflakes accumulated on her shoulders. And, "Hut, don't pay Harold Wilson any mind," a gentle voice said from behind her. "His heart's as small as his store is large." Emma turned to find a grey-haired woman with kind eyes and practical clothing. "I'm Clara Thompson," the woman said. "I run the boarding house just up the street. Come along, dear. You'll need somewhere warm tonight." Clara didn't wait for a response, simply gesturing to a young boy loitering nearby to fetch Emma's trunk. As they walked along Pine Ridge's main street, Clara spoke matter-of-factly. "Harold Wilson has brought 2 mail-order brides to Pine Ridge. In the past year, neither stayed longer than a fortnight. The man's expectations soar higher than these mountains, while his character sinks lower than a snake's belly." Emma pulled out her slate, but Clara waved it away with a gloved hand. "No need for that just now. You're tired and cold. We'll talk after you've had some rest and hot food in your belly." The boarding house was a 2-story structure with simple but elegant furnishings and the comforting smell of baking bread. Clara showed Emma to a small but clean room on the 2nd floor. "Supper's at 6, she said kindly. "Rest now. Tomorrow's soon enough to figure things out." Alone in the unfamiliar room, Emma finally allowed her tears to fall. The weight of her situation crushed down upon her, stranded in a frontier town with barely enough money for a return ticket and nothing to return to. She had sold most of her possessions to fund this journey, gambling everything on a fresh start. Now all she had was a trunk full of dresses too fine for a place like Pine Ridge, and the familiar ache of another failure. That evening at supper, Clara introduced Emma to the other boarders, 2 miners saving to bring their families west, a young school teacher named Miss Collins, and a widow who worked as the town's telegraph operator. When Clara explained Emma's situation, sympathetic glances were exchanged around the table. "Harold Wilson wouldn't recognize quality if it danced a jig on his counter," declared the widow firmly. "Any man who'd dismiss a bride because she's quiet has clearly never appreciated the virtue of peace and silence." Emma wrote on her slate, "I have enough for a ticket back east, but nothing awaits me there." "Can you sew?" asked Miss Collins. "The school teacher." Emma nodded. Her needlework had always earned praise. "Rachel Green at the tailoring shop mentioned needing help," Miss Collins offered. "She's been overwhelmed with work since the new silver mine opened. Perhaps you could speak with her tomorrow." For the first time since arriving in Pine Ridge, Emma felt a flicker of hope. The next morning, rather than boarding the eastbound train, Emma followed Miss Collins's directions to a modest shop just off the main street. A bell jingled as she entered a space filled with bolts of fabric, patterns, and half-finished garments. A plump woman in her 40s looked up from behind a cutting table. "Can I help you?" she asked, pushing spectacles higher on her nose. Emma presented her slate, on which she'd carefully written an introduction and explanation of her skills. Rachel Green read it thoughtfully. "Clara Thompson mentioned you might come by," she said. "Let me see your stitching." Emma opened her small handbag and withdrew a handkerchief she'd embroidered with delicate violets. Rachel examined it with an expert's eye, turning it over to inspect the neat, nearly invisible seams. "Most folks around here can't afford ready-made clothes," Rachel explained. "Those who can still prefer custom work. With the mine bringing new families every month, I have more orders than I can handle." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She paused, studying Emma's face. "I can offer you room and board above the shop plus $2 a week. If your work proves as fine as this sample, we'll discuss a proper salary after a month." Emma's shoulders sagged with relief as she wrote, "When may I start?" "Right now?" Rachel smiled. "That trunk looks heavy, and there's a perfectly good room going unused upstairs." For 2 weeks, Emma settled into a routine. She worked at the tailor shop during the day, quickly proving her worth with precise stitches and an eye for detail. That impressed even the demanding Rachel. In the evenings, she took her meals at Clara's boarding house, gradually becoming acquainted with the residents of Pine Ridge through Rachel's customers and Clara's boarders. Few made efforts to engage directly with the mute seamstress from the east, as she overheard herself described. Most directed their comments to Rachel, even when inquiring about work Emma had clearly done herself. She accepted this with the quiet resignation of someone accustomed to being overlooked. It was during her 3rd week in Pine Ridge that everything changed. Emma was alone in the shop, Rachel having gone to deliver a completed suit to the bank manager, when the bell above the door announced a customer. She looked up to see a tall man with broad shoulders and strong features standing just inside the entrance. His dark hair was longer than was fashionable, swept back from a face weathered by outdoor work. Though his clothes were plain, they were impeccably clean and well-maintained. He appeared to be in his mid-30s, with an intensity to his gaze. That made Emma straighten her posture. She rose from her work table and nodded in greeting. The man didn't respond to her gesture. Instead, he looked directly at her face with unusual focus. His lack of acknowledgement struck Emma as odd, but not threatening. She reached for her slate and wrote, "How may I help you?" The man continued to watch her, confusion crossing his features. Then, to Emma's astonishment, his hands began to move in deliberate gestures, forming shapes and movements she recognized from her childhood. Her aunt had worked briefly at a school for the deaf in Philadelphia and had taught young Emma the manual alphabet. The man was spelling words with his fingers. "Need shirt mended." He pointed to a tear along the sleeve of his coat, then made more hand gestures Emma didn't understand. Realization dawned. This man wasn't being rude or ignoring her. He was deaf. Emma put down her slate and slowly finger-spelled in return. "I can fix it." The transformation in the man's expression was immediate, his serious features warming with a smile that reached his eyes. He quickly shrugged off his coat, revealing the torn sleeve, and handed the garment to Emma. She gestured for him to wait and turned to examine the damage. It was a straightforward repair that would take only a few minutes. As she worked, she felt his gaze on her, but unlike the uncomfortable scrutiny she often endured, this felt different, observant rather than judgmental. When she finished, she returned the coat. He inspected her work with careful fingers before nodding in approval. From his pocket, he withdrew a few coins, but Emma shook her head and wrote on her slate, "No charge for a small repair." The man frowned, clearly unwilling to accept charity. He placed the coins firmly on the counter, then finger-spelled slowly so she could follow. "Daniel Cooper, ranch north of town," Emma replied with her own name, both in fingerspelling and written on the slate. Daniel studied her face, then signed something she didn't understand. Seeing her confusion, he pointed to her slate, and she handed it to him. His handwriting was unexpectedly elegant as he wrote, "You read lips." Emma shook her head and wrote, "Illness took most of my voice. I know some fingerspelling from my aunt who taught deaf children." Daniel read her words, then looked up with an expression that struck Emma to her core. There was no pity in his eyes, only recognition, the gaze of someone who understood what it meant to navigate a world designed for others. He wrote on the slate, "Come to dinner at my ranch. Sunday, I'll send a wagon." The invitation was so unexpected that Emma simply stared at him. Daniel tapped the slate, his expression questioning, waiting for her answer. Before she could respond, the shop door opened, and Rachel returned with Harold Wilson in tow. Harold stopped short at the sight of Emma standing close to the counter with Daniel. "What's going on here?" Harold demanded. Daniel, unaware of the question, calmly put his mended coat back on. Harold strode forward, positioning himself between Emma and Daniel. "Cooper, what business do you have with Miss Mitchell?" Daniel, noticing Harold's aggressive posture, frowned in confusion. Rachel quickly intervened. "Mr. Cooper needed a coat mended, Harold. Nothing improper was happening." Harold turned to Emma. "Is this true, or has the deaf rancher been bothering you?" The contempt in Harold's voice as he said deaf rancher sent a surge of indignation through Emma. She grabbed her slate and wrote in bold, clear letters, "Mr. Cooper has been a perfect gentleman, unlike some in this town." Harold's face reddened as he read her words. "I see you've found a kindred spirit in the town oddity," he sneered. "How fitting." Daniel, watching their faces intently, seemed to understand the tension even without hearing the words. He straightened to his full height, several inches taller than Harold, and fixed the shopkeeper with a hard stare that made the smaller man take an involuntary step backward. Rachel stepped between them. "That's enough, Harold. You've said your piece. Now I suggest you place your order or leave my shop." After Harold stormed out, Rachel turned to Emma with concern. "Be careful with Daniel Cooper, dear. He's a good man, but he lives alone for a reason. People here don't understand him, and they won't understand you spending time with him either." Emma looked at Daniel, who was watching them closely, trying to follow the conversation through their expressions. There was something in his steady gaze that made her feel truly seen for the first time since arriving in Pine Ridge. She picked up her slate and wrote her answer to his earlier invitation. "Sunday dinner, yes." The smile that spread across Daniel's face was like sunshine breaking through the Colorado clouds, warm, genuine, and full of promise. In that moment, Emma knew her journey to this remote frontier town might have a purpose after all. Sunday arrived with clear skies and gentle sunshine that belied the December cold. Emma stood on the porch of Clara's boarding house, dressed in her second-best dress, a practical navy wool with minimal embellishments. She'd spent the previous evening altering it to better suit the Western style she'd observed among the local women. "You look lovely," Clara said, coming to stand beside her, "though I still think this outing is hasty. You barely know Daniel Cooper." Emma pulled out her slate. "I feel comfortable with him. We understand each other." Clara sighed. "That may be so, but remember his ranch is 7 miles outside town. His nearest neighbor is the Perry family, another mile beyond. If you need help." Emma wrote firmly, "I'll be fine. Mr. Cooper has been nothing but respectful." "It's not just that," Clara lowered her voice. "Daniel's been alone since his mother died 5 years ago. Before that, it was just the two of them since he was a boy. He didn't grow up around many women, and with his condition." Emma frowned and wrote, "His deafness doesn't make him dangerous." "Of course not," Clara backpedaled, "but he's isolated himself. People talk. They say he's grown strange from living alone, that he's more comfortable with animals than people." From down the street came the sound of wagon wheels on the packed snow. Emma's heart quickened as she spotted a well-maintained wagon drawn by 2 dappled gray horses. Daniel handled the reins with confidence, his posture straight and sure. What struck Emma immediately was his transformation. Gone were the working clothes from their first meeting. Today, Daniel wore a clean white shirt under a dark vest, with his hair neatly combed and face freshly shaved. He looked almost handsome in a rugged, weathered way that spoke of hard work and self-reliance. As the wagon pulled to a stop, Emma descended the porch steps. Daniel jumped down and offered a small, uncertain smile. In his hand was a simple bouquet of pine branches and dried winter berries, the only color to be found in the December landscape. Clara followed Emma down the steps. "Mr. Cooper," she called loudly, then caught herself and nodded instead. Daniel nodded back before turning his attention to Emma. He presented the makeshift bouquet with a formal bow that seemed practiced, as though he'd rehearsed this moment. Emma accepted the gesture with a genuine smile, her eyes conveying a thanks. Daniel pointed to his wrist where a watch might sit, then to the sky, indicating they should depart before the winter day grew too short. After helping Emma onto the wagon seat, he exchanged a look with Clara that contained a silent promise. He would take care of her boarder. "Have her back before dark," Clara instructed with exaggerated hand gestures. Daniel nodded solemnly before climbing up beside Emma. As they left town behind, buildings giving way to snow-covered pines and open meadows, Emma felt a curious sense of freedom. The space between them on the wagon seat was small enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from Daniel's solid frame, yet he was careful not to crowd her. Emma pulled out her slate and wrote, "Thank you for the invitation." Daniel glanced at her words, then signed something before remembering she didn't understand his gestures. He took the slate and wrote, "Thank you for accepting. Not many would." The simple honesty of his statement touched Emma deeply. In just a few words, he had acknowledged their shared status as outsiders. The road gradually climbed into rolling hills covered with evergreens. Around a bend, Daniel's ranch came into view, a modest but well-maintained homestead nestled in a protected valley. A sturdy log house stood at the center, with a barn, corral, and several outbuildings arranged around it. A creek, partially frozen, meandered across the property, and Emma could see cattle gathered in a sheltered pasture. It wasn't the grand ranch of a cattle baron, but neither was it the primitive cabin she had feared. The house itself was larger than she expected, with glass windows that caught the midday sun and a stone chimney from which smoke gently curled. Daniel brought the wagon to a halt in front of the house and helped Emma down. She noticed his hands were calloused but clean, his grip firm yet gentle. Up close, she could see flecks of amber in his brown eyes and the slight nervousness in his expression that matched her own. He led her to the porch and held the door open. The interior surprised Emma. It was simple but comfortable and notably clean. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, with well-crafted wooden furniture arranged for conversation. Bookshelves, unexpected in a ranch house, especially one belonging to a deaf man, lined another wall. Daniel gestured for her to make herself comfortable while he disappeared into what must be the kitchen. Emma wandered to the bookshelves, running her fingers along the spines of books ranging from practical manuals on animal husbandry to volumes of classical literature. Many appeared well-worn. She was examining a volume of Emerson's essays when Daniel returned with 2 cups of coffee. He watched her holding the book, and a question formed in his eyes. Emma accepted the coffee and wrote on her slate, "You enjoy literature?" Daniel set his cup down to free his hands. He took the slate and wrote, "My mother taught me to read when I was young. Books became my connection to the world of sound." Emma nodded in understanding. For her, writing had become her voice when speech failed her. "How long have you been deaf?" she wrote. "Since birth," he replied. "Never heard anything." This revelation surprised her. Daniel carried himself with such awareness of his surroundings that she had assumed he had lost his hearing later in life. "How do you manage the ranch alone?" she asked. Daniel's expression brightened. He gestured for her to follow him to the window, where he pointed to a young man working with horses in the corral. "Nathan Perry," he wrote, "neighbor's son, works for me 3 days a week. Today is special occasion." He paused, then added, "Ranch was my grandfather's, then father's, now mine. 40 cattle, 8 horses, 200 acres." There was unmistakable pride in his written words, the satisfaction of a man who had preserved his family's legacy despite significant challenges. Daniel then led her to the kitchen, where the table was already set for their meal. A pot of stew simmered on the stove, filling the room with appetizing aromas. Emma raised an eyebrow, impressed. Understanding her unasked question, Daniel wrote, "I cook for myself. Mother taught me. Not fancy, but good." And it was. The stew contained tender beef, potatoes, carrots, and herbs that complemented each other perfectly. Fresh bread, clearly baked that morning, accompanied the meal. Emma hadn't expected such domesticity from a bachelor rancher, especially one who lived so isolated from society. As they ate, they developed a rhythm of communication, passing the slate back and forth, with Emma occasionally whispering words that Daniel would study her lips to understand. It was slow, deliberate conversation, but somehow more meaningful than the empty chatter Emma had endured at Philadelphia social gatherings. Daniel wrote about his daily life, rising before dawn to tend the animals, the seasonal cycles of ranch work, the quiet evenings spent reading by firelight. Emma shared stories of Philadelphia, her training as a seamstress in her mother's shop, and her love of creating beautiful things from fabric and thread. Neither mentioned their respective disabilities directly, yet they hovered in the background of every exchange, not as barriers, but as the very reason they could understand each other's experiences of isolation. After the meal, Daniel offered to show Emma the rest of the property. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as they walked from the barn to the creek, Daniel pointing out his projects and plans for the ranch. His ambitions were modest but clear, expanding the herd gradually, improving the breeding stock perhaps, adding an orchard near the house. At the corral, Nathan Perry tipped his hat to Emma, his friendly smile revealing none of the wariness she typically encountered in town. "Miss Mitchell," he greeted. "Mr. Cooper has been looking forward to your visit all week, cleaned the house twice over." Emma smiled at this revelation, glancing at Daniel, who was focused on adjusting a strap on one of the horses and hadn't seen the exchange. "He's a good man," Nathan continued, lowering his voice. "Folks in town don't give him enough credit. Smartest rancher in the county, if you ask me. Got methods for raising cattle that others are just starting to figure out." Emma nodded, wishing she could respond more fully. She pulled out her slate and wrote, "He seems very capable." "More than capable," Nathan affirmed. "My pa says if Daniel could hear, he'd be running the biggest ranch in the territory by now. As it is, he does more with these 200 acres than most do with 1,000. Daniel turned from the horse, catching them in conversation. His expression showed mild curiosity, but no suspicion. He trusted Nathan, Emma realized, a luxury rarely afforded to those with disabilities in a world quick to take advantage of. Perceived weakness. As the afternoon waned, they returned to the house. Daniel built up the fire against the evening chill and offered more coffee. While he prepared it, Emma noticed a small table in the corner with various tools and what appeared to be clockwork mechanisms in different stages of repair. When Daniel returned, she pointed questioningly at the workbench. "I repair watches and clocks," he wrote. "People from town bring them. Good work for winter evenings." Emma approached the table to examine his work more closely. The precision of the tiny gears and springs laid out in careful order spoke of patience and extraordinary attention to detail. "This is impressive," she wrote. "How did you learn?" "Father had a pocket watch that stopped. No money to fix it. Taught myself from a book." Emma marveled at this revelation. The man before her had overcome not just deafness, but the prejudice and limitations others placed upon him through sheer determination and ingenuity. As the light began to fade, Daniel reluctantly wrote that they should start back to town. Clara's warning about returning before dark hung between them, unwritten but understood. The ride back was quiet, both lost in thought as the wagon trundled along the darkening road. Emma found herself wishing the ranch were closer to town, that their day didn't have to end so soon. When they reached the boarding house, Daniel helped her down from the wagon, his hand lingering on hers a moment longer than necessary. In the golden light spilling from Clara's windows, his face showed a mixture of hope and resignation. He took her slate and wrote, "Thank you for coming. Best day in very long time." Emma read his words and felt a warmth spread through her chest. She took back the slate and wrote, "When can I see you again?" The smile that transformed Daniel's face was answer enough, but he wrote anyway, "Market day, Thursday, meet at noon." Emma nodded, then on impulse reached out and squeezed his hand. The simple gesture conveyed what neither her weak voice nor written words could fully express: connection, appreciation, understanding. From the porch, Clara cleared her throat pointedly. Daniel stepped back, tipping his hat to both women before climbing back onto his wagon. As he drove away, Emma watched until the darkness swallowed the outline of wagon and man. "Well?" Clara said, her tone carefully neutral. "I see you've returned safely." Emma nodded, her mind still at the ranch with its books and clocks and the man who had created a life of dignity despite the world's dismissal. "Was it pleasant?" Clara asked, curiosity overcoming her earlier reservations. Emma wrote on her slate, "Very much so. He's kind and intelligent." Clara studied Emma's face. "You're glowing, dear. I haven't seen you look so animated since you arrived." Inside, over tea, Clara's questions continued, each answered patiently by Emma's chalk on slate. Yes, his house was clean and well kept. No, he hadn't been improper in any way. Yes, he cooked the meal himself. "Remarkable," Clara murmured. "Though I suppose when you live alone as he has, you learn to manage." Before retiring for the night, Emma wrote one last message. "I'm meeting him again on Thursday." Clara's eyebrows rose, but she didn't object. "Just be careful, Emma. Not of Daniel. I believe you when you say he's honorable, but of this town. Pine Ridge can be cruel to those who don't fit their expectations. They already whisper about the mute seamstress from the east. If you align yourself with the deaf rancher, those whispers will grow louder." Emma straightened her shoulders and wrote firmly, "Let them whisper. I've heard worse in Philadelphia parlors." That night, Emma dreamed not of eastern cobblestone streets or the life she'd left behind, but of open Colorado skies and a ranch house filled with books. In her dream, she and Daniel sat by a fire, communicating effortlessly without words or slate, just understanding flowing between them like the creek that wound through his land. She woke before dawn, restless with new possibilities. For the first time since the fever that had taken her voice, Emma felt the stirrings of something like hope, not just for survival, but for a life with meaning. The week crawled by, each day at Rachel's shop stretching endlessly as Emma anticipated Thursday's meeting. She found herself watching the door whenever the bell jingled, hoping to see Daniel, though she knew he rarely came to town except on market days. Rachel noticed her distraction as Emma pricked her finger for the third time while hemming a dress. "You've got it bad, haven't you?" the seamstress asked with a knowing smile. Emma felt heat rise to her cheeks as she shook her head in denial. "No use pretending with me, girl. I've seen that look before." Rachel sat down beside her. "Clara told me about your Sunday adventure, said you came back looking happier than she'd ever seen you." Emma busied herself with the hem, avoiding Rachel's gaze. "I think it's wonderful," Rachel continued, surprising. "Emma, this town needs more people willing to see beyond what's on the surface. And Daniel Cooper deserves some happiness. That man's had more than his share of hardship." Emma looked up questioningly. "You didn't know? His father was killed in a mining accident when Daniel was just 8. His mother raised him alone, taught him to read lips and use that hand language. When he was 20, she fell ill, consumption, and he cared for her for 3 years before she passed. He's been alone ever since. This new knowledge settled over Emma like a mantle. She had sensed a deep well of strength in Daniel, but hadn't understood its source. His self-sufficiency wasn't just adaptation to deafness, it was born of necessity, of responsibilities shouldered far too young. That ranch should have failed a dozen times over, Rachel continued, but somehow Daniel kept it going, even during the drought 4 summers ago that took half the cattle in the county. He's got away with animals, like they understand him better than people do. When Thursday finally arrived, Emma dressed with special care in a forest green dress she'd made herself, with buttons of polished horn that complemented her auburn hair. At precisely noon, she stood outside the general store, heart fluttering against her ribs like a bird seeking freedom. The market day crowd bustled around her, farmers with winter vegetables, ranchers with goods to trade, townspeople taking advantage of the weekly gathering to socialize. Emma stood apart, watching for the familiar figure of Daniel among the strangers. The clock on the mercantile wall showed 12:30, and still no sign of Daniel. Emma shifted uneasily, ignoring the curious glances from passers-by. Perhaps he had changed his mind. Or worse, something had happened to him on the ranch, an accident with no one to hear his calls for help. Just as anxiety began to tighten her chest, Emma spotted Harold Wilson approaching, his smile holding none of the warmth she'd seen in Daniel's eyes. "Miss Mitchell," he greeted with exaggerated volume, as though her voice affliction affected her hearing. "Waiting for someone?" Emma gave a non-committal nod, hoping he would continue on his way. "If you're expecting Cooper, I'm afraid you'll be disappointed." Harold's tone carried a note of satisfaction. "Sheriff Tanner detained him at the livery stable. Seems there was some confusion about payment for feed." Alarm flashed through Emma. She reached for her slate, but Harold continued before she could write. "Such a shame, the challenges of conducting business when one can't properly communicate." He shook his head in mock sympathy. "Perhaps this illustrates why certain arrangements are unwise." Emma's chalk nearly snapped as she wrote, "Where is the livery stable?" Harold's smile faded. "Now, Miss Mitchell, this is hardly a matter for a lady to involve herself in. The sheriff will sort it out." She brushed past him, slate clutched to her chest, and headed toward the far end of the main street where she recalled seeing the livery. The scene at the livery stable made her blood boil. Daniel stood in the center of a small crowd, his normally confident posture tense with frustration. Sheriff Tanner, a tall man with a silver mustache, was speaking loudly and slowly, exaggerating his mouth movements in a way that bordered on mockery. "I said, do you have a receipt?" The sheriff practically shouted. Daniel's hands moved rapidly in signs Emma couldn't understand, his expression a mixture of anger and humiliation. The livery owner, a thin man with stooped shoulders, stood to the side, shaking his head. "I told him last month the price went up. Not my fault if he didn't understand." Emma pushed through the onlookers until she stood at Daniel's side. His eyes widened in surprise, then softened with relief at the sight of her. She quickly wrote on her slate, "What happened?" Daniel took the slate, his writing hurried. "Price changed. Livery says I owe more. Already paid what was agreed." Emma turned to face the sheriff and livery owner. She wrote on her slate and held it up for all to see. "Mr. Cooper cannot hear you shouting. What exactly is the dispute?" The sheriff glanced at her words with obvious irritation. "This isn't your concern, miss." The livery owner was more forthcoming. "Cooper has an account for horse feed. Prices went up 3 cents a pound last month due to the rail freight increases. Posted a notice right here on the door." He gestured to a weathered paper tacked beside the entrance. "He shorted me $450 on his last pickup." Emma looked at Daniel, who was watching the exchange intently, trying to follow the conversation through expressions and gestures. She could see the frustration in the tight set of his jaw. She wrote on the slate and showed it to Daniel. "Did you know about the price increase?" He shook his head firmly, then took the slate. Would have paid if I knew. Never saw notice. Of course he hadn't, Emma realized. A written notice would only work if someone brought it to his attention, or if he happened to look directly at it. The livery owner had made no effort to ensure his deaf customer understood the change. Emma wrote a longer message and showed it. To the sheriff and livery owner, Mr. Cooper was unaware of the price change. A written notice is insufficient for someone who cannot hear verbal announcements. He has always paid his debts and will pay the difference now. The sheriff read her words aloud, his tone grudging. Well, Jenkins, what's the exact amount owed? The livery owner hesitated, then muttered, $4.50. Daniel, who had been watching their lips carefully, immediately reached into his pocket and produced the exact amount. He handed it to Jenkins with a dignity that made Emma's heart ache. The sheriff shrugged. Seems this matter is resolved, he said, then turned to the dispersing crowd. Show's over, folks. Go about your business. As the onlookers scattered, Emma noticed Harold Wilson lingering on the periphery, disappointment evident in his face. She had no doubt he'd played some role in this humiliation. Daniel touched her arm gently to get her attention. When she looked at him, he signed, "Thank you," one of the few gestures she recognized, his eyes conveying depths of gratitude words couldn't express. She smiled and wrote, "Still have time for lunch." His answering smile chased away the last traces of tension from his face. They walked to a small cafe at the edge of town, away from the prying eyes of the market day crowd. The owner, Mrs. Harrison, greeted them with a warm smile that contained no judgment, only welcome. "Take any table you like," she told Emma, then nodded respectfully to Daniel. "Good to see you again, Mr. Cooper." Over bowls of hearty stew and fresh bread, they exchanged the slate back and forth. Daniel explained that he'd been delayed because the sheriff had intercepted him almost immediately upon his arrival in town. "I should have expected trouble," he wrote. "Harold Wilson never forgave me for outbidding him on the Larson property last spring." Emma raised an eyebrow questioningly. "He wanted to expand his investments," Daniel explained. "Thought ranching would be easy money. Was angry when the deaf man got the better parcel." As they ate, Emma noticed Daniel was unusually attentive to their surroundings, his eyes constantly scanning the room. She realized he was compensating for his lack of hearing with heightened visual awareness. Nothing escaped his notice. "You read people well," she wrote. Daniel nodded. "Have to. Survival. People say much with faces and bodies they don't say with words." This insight struck Emma deeply. She too had learned to read the subtle shifts in expression, the microaggressions hidden behind polite society smiles. Their disabilities had given them similar perceptions through different paths. "I brought something for you," Daniel wrote, pulling a small package from his jacket pocket. Wrapped in brown paper tied with string was a slim book, a manual of hand communication for the deaf. It was well worn, its pages soft from years of handling. "My mother's," Daniel explained. "Thought you might want to learn more signs. Easier than writing everything." Emma was touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. She opened the book, flipping through pages illustrated with hand positions and their corresponding meanings. "I would like to learn," she wrote, then hesitantly attempted to form the sign for thank you, as she had seen him do. Daniel's face brightened. He gently corrected the position of her fingers, his touch light but sure. The moment of connection lingered between them, a bridge built of shared understanding. After lunch, they walked through the market together. Daniel purchased supplies for the ranch, introducing Emma to vendors he trusted with simple gestures and written notes. She observed how some treated him with respect, engaging patiently in their unconventional communication, while others spoke to him as though he were a child, or, worse, addressed only her as if Daniel weren't present. Through it all, he maintained, a stoic dignity that Emma admired. The humiliation at the livery stable had been frustrating but not surprising to him, just another day navigating a world designed for hearing people. At the mercantile, Harold Wilson watched their progress through the store with undisguised disapproval. When Daniel went to examine tools in another aisle, Harold approached Emma. "I see you've become quite the champion for our local oddity," he said in a low voice. "Is this some misguided Eastern charity, Miss Mitchell? Or perhaps you believe damaged goods should stick together?" The cruelty of his words stung, but Emma had endured worse in Philadelphia drawing rooms. She wrote on her slate, "Mr. Cooper is more of a gentleman than many who can hear and speak perfectly well." Harold's face flushed. "You're making a spectacle of yourself. First arriving as a mail-order bride, then being rejected, and now this association with a deaf rancher. People are talking." Emma shrugged and wrote, "Let them. Their opinions matter little to me." "They should," Harold hissed. "A woman alone can't afford to ignore society's judgment. You have no protector, no family. Your reputation is all you have." The truth in his words cut deeper than she wanted to admit. She did stand alone, her future precarious. But yielding to the petty prejudices of Pine Ridge was a price too high to pay for security. Before she could respond, Daniel returned, immediately. Sensing the tension, he looked between Emma and Harold, his expression questioning. Harold switched to an artificial smile. "Mr. Cooper," he said with exaggerated mouth movements, "just having a friendly chat with Miss Mitchell. Good day to you both." He retreated to his counter, where several customers awaited his attention. Outside in the winter sunshine, Daniel took the slate. "What did he say to upset you?" Emma hesitated, then wrote, "He thinks we shouldn't be friends because of our differences." Daniel's jaw tightened, but his response surprised her. "He may be right. Your life would be easier without the complications I bring." The selflessness of his concern touched Emma deeply. She wrote firmly, "I've had enough of easy paths that lead nowhere. I prefer difficult journeys with worthwhile companions." Something shifted in Daniel's expression. A wall coming down, hope cautiously rising. He offered his arm, and she took it, conscious of the statement they made walking arm in arm down Pine Ridge's main street. When they reached Clara's boarding house all too soon, Daniel took Emma's slate one last time. "Can I see you again? Sunday dinner?" She nodded, then impulsively reached up to touch his cheek, letting her fingers say what her voice and chalk could not. Daniel caught her hand, pressing it gently against his face for a moment before releasing it with obvious reluctance. As he walked away, Emma clutched the sign language book to her chest, already planning to study it before their next meeting. Clara was waiting in the parlor, her expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. "I heard about the commotion at the livery. Half the town's talking about how you rushed to Daniel Cooper's defense." Emma nodded, unapologetic. "Harold Wilson came by earlier," Clara continued. "Seemed quite disturbed. Said you were compromising yourself by associating with Daniel." Emma's eyes flashed with anger as she wrote, "Harold Wilson engineered that entire incident to humiliate Daniel. He's a petty, cruel man." Clara sighed. "I don't disagree with your assessment of Harold, but Emma, you must consider your position carefully. You're still building your life here. Creating enemies of influential townspeople is risky. So is abandoning someone because they're different," Emma wrote. "I won't do it. Not again." The words slipped out before she could reconsider them. Clara's eyebrows rose. "Again? There's a story there, I think." Emma hesitated, then wrote slowly, "After my illness, many friends vanished. Conversation became too difficult. Invitations stopped. My fiancé returned my ring with a note saying he couldn't bear a lifetime of silence." Clara's expression softened. "Oh, my dear, no wonder you understand Daniel's isolation. We speak the same language," Emma wrote. one of patience and perseverance. For the next 2 days, Emma devoted herself to learning sign language from Daniel's book. Her fingers, nimble from years of detailed needlework, quickly adapted to the precise movements. She practiced between customers at Rachel's shop during meals and late into the night by candlelight. Rachel caught her signing to herself while sorting buttons on Saturday afternoon. "Well, look at you," she said with approval. "That's a far better solution than that slate you're always carrying." Emma smiled, grateful for the encouragement. She wrote, "I want to surprise Daniel tomorrow. Show him I'm making an effort to learn his language." "That man's already smitten with you," Rachel chuckled. "This will absolutely seal his fate." On Sunday, Nathan Perry arrived with the wagon instead of Daniel. "He's laid up with a badly sprained ankle," Nathan explained. "Nothing serious, but he wanted me to fetch you if you're still willing to come. Said he'd understand if you'd rather not." Emma gathered her reticule and shawl without hesitation, much to Clara's dismay. "Alone at his ranch while he's injured," Clara fretted. "It's not proper, Emma," Nathan interjected. "My mother's there, Mrs. Thompson. Came over to help with the cooking and such. She can chaperone just fine." This assurance slightly mollified Clara, though she still insisted Emma return before nightfall. The ride to the ranch seemed quicker this time, Emma's anticipation growing with each mile. When they arrived, Nathan led her to the house, where she found Daniel sitting by the fire, his left foot bandaged and propped on a small stool. His face lit up at the sight of her, though embarrassment quickly followed. "Caught his foot in a prairie dog hole while checking fences," explained a cheerful, round-faced woman Emma assumed was Mrs. Perry. "Men and their stubborn pride wouldn't rest until he'd finished the entire north section, swollen up like a summer melon by the time he got back to the house." Daniel grimaced at Mrs. Perry's animated gestures toward his injury, clearly understanding. She was discussing his mishap. Mrs. Perry addressed Emma directly. "You must be Miss Mitchell. I'm Margaret Perry. Daniel's told us so much about you, or rather written so much." She smiled warmly. "I'll just be in the kitchen finishing dinner. Nathan can help with the afternoon chores." As they departed, leaving Emma and Daniel alone in the main room, an awkward silence fell. Daniel looked frustrated by his injury, as though he had failed her somehow by not being at his best. Emma set down her reticule and removed her coat and bonnet. Then, instead of reaching for her slate, she raised her hands and carefully signed, "I have been practicing." Daniel's expression transformed from surprise to wonder. He sat forward eagerly, his own hands coming up to sign. "You learned for me?" She nodded, forming the signs with deliberate care. "Your book helped. Still learning, please go slow." The joy on his face made every hour of practice worthwhile. He signed slowly, "This means more than you know." For the next hour, they conversed in this new shared language. Emma frequently consulted the book she'd brought along, and Daniel patiently corrected her form when needed. It was halting and imperfect, but infinitely more intimate than passing a slate back and forth. When Mrs. Perry called them for dinner, Emma was surprised to realize how quickly the time had passed. The meal itself was a pleasant affair, with Mrs. Perry filling the silence with cheerful chatter about local news, while Emma and Daniel communicated through a combination of signs, facial expressions, and occasional written notes. "It's remarkable," Mrs. Perry commented, watching them. "I've known Daniel since he was a boy, and I've never seen him communicate so easily with anyone outside his mother." After dinner, despite Daniel's protests, Mrs. Perry insisted on clearing up alone. "You two go sit by the fire. That ankle needs rest, Daniel Cooper, and I won't hear arguments." In the fading light of afternoon, they returned to the main room, where Daniel carefully shifted his position to face Emma more directly. His expression had grown serious. "I need to ask something important," he signed, his movements deliberate. Emma nodded, her heart quickening. People in town are talking about you because of me, he continued. Harold Wilson spreading rumors. Said you're ruining your chances by spending time with the deaf man. Emma frowned, signing. Harold Wilson doesn't decide my life. But he's right, Daniel insisted. You could have a normal life. Find a husband who can hear. Have an easier path. The frustration that had simmered since the incident at the livery burst forth. Emma signed emphatically. Don't want an easier path. Don't want normal. She paused, struggling to find the right signs, then resorted to the slate. I came, west hoping for a fresh start. Yes, but also for authenticity. In Philadelphia, I pretended my voice would return, that I could still fit into society. It was exhausting and lonely. Here with you, I don't pretend. I don't need to. Daniel read her words, his expression softening. He wrote beneath her message, I feel the same, but I worry. Life with me would never be easy. Life isn't meant to be easy, she wrote. It's meant to be lived truthfully. Something shifted in Daniel's gaze, determination replacing uncertainty. He set down the slate, and with his good hand, signed slowly, Then may I court you properly with intention. The directness of his question took Emma's breath away. In Philadelphia, courtship was a dance of innuendo and social maneuvering. Daniel offered honesty instead, a clear path rather than a maze of conventions. Her hands trembled slightly as she signed, Yes, I would like that very much. The smile that spread across Daniel's face held the promise of spring after a long winter, hope blooming in unlikely soil. In that moment, in a ranch house far from the world she'd known, Emma Mitchell felt something she had thought lost forever, the sensation of coming home. By February, winter still gripped the Colorado mountains, but the days were gradually lengthening. In Rachel's tailor shop, business remained steady as townspeople requested repairs to winter clothing damaged by the harsh season. You've become indispensable, Rachel commented as Emma efficiently completed an intricate mending job on the banker's wife's cloak. My hands aren't as nimble as they once were. I couldn't keep up without you. Over the past weeks, Emma's position had evolved from temporary helper to essential partner. Rachel had even suggested changing the shop sign to Green and Mitchell Tailoring come spring, an offer that had stunned Emma with its generosity. More surprising still was the gradual shift in how some townspeople treated her. Those who had initially avoided direct communication now made efforts to engage, albeit awkwardly at times. A few had even requested that she teach them simple signs after observing her conversations with Daniel during his weekly visits to town. Not everyone had warmed to her, of course. Harold Wilson still watched with barely concealed contempt whenever she and Daniel were seen together. The Reverend's wife made pointed remarks about proper companionship, and several of the town's more prominent ladies continued to speak about Emma rather than to her. But these voices were increasingly outnumbered by those who had come to appreciate her skill with a needle and her quiet dignity. The evolution reminded Emma of something Daniel had signed during one of their Sunday afternoons. People fear what they don't understand until understanding becomes easier than fear. Emma was pinning a pattern when the shop bell jangled. She looked up to see a well-dressed stranger, a man in his 50s with silver-streaked hair and the unmistakable bearing of Eastern wealth. His eyes widened at the sight of her. "Emma Mitchell," he said, his voice reflecting disbelief. "Thank God you're alive." She recognized him immediately. Edward Blackwood, her father's former business partner and the executor of her parents' modest estate. The last time she'd seen him had been at her mother's funeral. Rachel glanced between them, then discreetly retreated to the back room. Emma reached for her slate, but before she could write, Edward crossed the shop and clasped her hands. "We feared the worst," he said, studying her face, "when you disappeared without a word. If your father's solicitor hadn't mentioned you'd inquired about trains west." He shook his head. "Why, Emma? Why leave without telling anyone? She wrote quickly, I needed a fresh start. Philadelphia held too many painful memories. Edward read her words, his expression softening. I understand that, but to vanish, to throw yourself into the wilderness without resources or protection. I'm not as fragile as everyone believed, she wrote firmly. Clearly not, he acknowledged, glancing around the modest shop. But this can't be the life Henry and Eleanor Mitchell wanted for their daughter, working as a seamstress in a frontier town. Emma bristled at the implied judgment, but before she could respond, Edward continued. I've come to bring you home, Emma. James Harrington has been inconsolable since you left. Shock rendered Emma momentarily speechless. James had been her fiancé, the man who had returned her ring after her illness, with a note expressing relief that they wouldn't face a lifetime of awkward silence. Edward misinterpreted her silence as consideration. He's prepared to resume your engagement immediately. The house on Walnut Street is still available. He would purchase it for you as a wedding gift. You could reclaim your rightful place in society. Emma's hands trembled slightly as she wrote, Why this change of heart? Edward hesitated. James has matured, and there have been developments with your father's investments. What developments? She pressed. The railway stocks your father purchased before his death have increased substantially in value. The estate has been trying to locate you as the sole heir. Understanding dawned with painful clarity. She wasn't destitute after all. And suddenly, James had found his conscience. How much? She wrote bluntly. A considerable sum, Edward admitted. Enough to make you one of Philadelphia's more comfortable young women. Emma took a deep breath, organizing her thoughts. She had come to Colorado, believing she needed a husband for security. Now she learned she had options: financial independence, a return to familiar surroundings, even a rekindled engagement. Yet, as she contemplated these possibilities, she felt no pull toward her former life. Instead, her mind filled with images of Daniel's ranch, his patient hands teaching her to sign, the quiet understanding between them that required no words at all. I'm not returning to Philadelphia, she wrote with steady resolve. Please thank James for his timely change of heart, but I must decline. Edward's eyebrows rose in disbelief. Surely you're not serious. What could possibly hold you in this primitive place? Before she could answer, the shop door opened and Daniel entered, stomping snow from his boots. He had come to town earlier than usual, a small wooden box tucked under one arm, likely another clock repair. He stopped short at the sight of Emma with a stranger, his expression shifting from surprise to quiet assessment. Edward turned to study Daniel, whose eyes remained fixed on Emma, sensing her tension. Without hesitation, Daniel crossed to her side, his questioning gaze never leaving her face. Emma signed rapidly. This is my father's friend from Philadelphia. He wants me to return. Understanding dawned in Daniel's expression, followed by a shadow of resignation. He nodded slightly, then extended his hand to Edward with dignified formality. Edward's shock was evident as he automatically shook Daniel's hand. I don't understand. Who is this man? Rachel stepped forward from the back room. Mr. Blackwood, this is Daniel Cooper. He owns one of the more successful ranches in the area. And he's deaf? Edward asked, observing the sign exchange between Emma and Daniel. Yes, Rachel confirmed, and one of the finest men in the territory. Edward turned to Emma with dawning comprehension. Is this why you won't return to Philadelphia? Because of him? Emma signed to Daniel. He discovered I've inherited money. James wants to marry me now. A flicker of pain crossed Daniel's features before he carefully schooled his expression. He signed back. You should consider the offer. Security, comfort, a familiar place. The selflessness of his response, putting her welfare above his own desires, cemented Emma's decision. She turned to Edward and wrote firmly, "I'm building a life here. A good life with people who value me as I am, not despite or because of my limitations." Edward looked between them, his worldview visibly shaken. "Emma, be reasonable. What kind of future could you possibly have with—" He gestured helplessly at Daniel. "With these circumstances?" Daniel, who had been reading their lips as best he could, straightened his shoulders. He took Emma's slate and wrote in his precise hand, "Mr. Blackwood, I understand your concern for Emma's welfare. It's a concern I share. But I believe a person's worth isn't measured by their limitations, but by their determination to overcome them." Edward read these words with surprise, clearly not expecting such eloquence from a frontier rancher, much less a deaf one. Emma added beneath Daniel's message, "I came west seeking a husband for security. I found something more valuable, self-reliance and happiness. I won't trade that for all the comfort Philadelphia offers." "At least take time to consider," Edward pleaded. "I'll be staying at the hotel for 3 days before returning east. The railway shares are yours, regardless of your decision. I'll make arrangements with the local bank." After Edward departed, an awkward silence fell. Rachel tactfully excused herself, leaving Emma and Daniel alone in the shop. "I'm sorry," Daniel signed. "Bad timing." "No," Emma replied. "Perfect timing. Now everything is clear." Daniel's expression remained troubled. "You have a chance for a better life now. Money changes things." Emma shook her head firmly. "Money doesn't change what matters." She hesitated, then added, "Unless you don't want me to stay." The vulnerability in her question broke through Daniel's careful reserve. He took her hands, stilling their motion, and looked directly into her eyes. Then he released her to sign, "I want you in my life more than anything, but I need to know you stay for the right reasons, not because you have nowhere else to go." In that moment, Emma realized the depth of Daniel's insecurities, not about his deafness, but about being chosen freely, without reservation. She reached for the slate, needing to express herself fully. "I'm staying because in Philadelphia, I was defined by what I'd lost, my voice, my parents, my place in society. Here with you, I'm defined by what I've found, strength, purpose, and a connection I never thought possible. My inheritance changes nothing about what I want or who I want to be with." Daniel read her words, his eyes suspiciously bright in the winter light. He wrote beneath her message, "Then will you come to the Founders' Day celebration with me next weekend as my declared sweetheart?" A smile bloomed across Emma's face as she signed an emphatic yes. The morning of Founders' Day dawned clear and cold. Pine Ridge's main street had been transformed with banners and decorations commemorating the town's 20th anniversary. Stalls lined the thoroughfare, offering everything from handmade quilts to maple candy. In the town square, a platform had been erected for speeches, and later a dance floor for the evening's festivities. Emma stood before the mirror in her room, at the boarding house, adjusting the collar of her new dress, a creation of her own design in deep burgundy wool with intricate embroidery at the cuffs and neckline. Rachel had insisted she use the finest fabric in the shop. "If you're going to make a statement, make it magnificent," the seamstress had declared, and a statement it would be. Today, Emma would appear publicly as Daniel's sweetheart for the first time, an announcement that would formalize their courtship to the entire community. Clara knocked on her door. "Daniel's here," she called, "and my goodness, the man looks handsome." In the parlor, Daniel waited in a new suit of dark blue, his hair neatly trimmed, boots polished to a shine. When Emma entered, his expression of admiration needed no translation. "You look beautiful," he signed. "So do you," she replied with a teasing smile. Clara watched their exchange with misty eyes. "You two will be the handsomest couple there," she declared. "Now off with you, the festivities are starting." As they walked toward the town square, Emma was acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed them. Some were merely curious, others openly disapproving. Harold Wilson stood outside his store, his face darkening at the sight of them arm in arm. Yet for every hostile glance, there seemed to be a friendly nod. Rachel waved cheerfully from her, stall displaying fine handwork. Nathan Perry tipped his hat respectfully, his parents beside him offering warm smiles. Even Sheriff Tanner nodded a grudging acknowledgement. The morning passed pleasantly as they explored the various stalls. Daniel purchased a hair comb for Emma, carved from mountain cherry wood. She helped him select a new, leather-bound journal from the bookseller's display. They were examining a woodworker's carvings when Edward Blackwood approached, looking somewhat out of place in his Eastern attire. "Emma," he greeted, then nodded to Daniel. "Mr. Cooper." To her surprise, Edward attempted a clumsy finger-spelled hello that made Daniel's eyebrows rise in surprise. "I spoke with Mrs. Thompson yesterday," Edward explained. "She suggested I might better understand your decision if I learned a bit about your communication methods." Emma smiled, touched by his effort. "I've made arrangements with the bank as promised," Edward continued. "Your inheritance will be available to you here. I'll leave the details with Mrs. Thompson before I depart tomorrow." Daniel, who had been following their lips, signed to Emma. "He seems to accept your decision." She nodded, then wrote for Edward. "I appreciate your concern for my welfare. Please tell everyone in Philadelphia that I am well and happy." Edward studied her face, then Daniel's, and something in his expression softened. "I believe you are. Your father would be proud of the independent woman you've become, different from what he might have envisioned, but proud nonetheless." After he walked away, Daniel signed, "Good man, cares for you." "Yes," Emma agreed, "but he belongs to my past." At noon, the town gathered before the platform where Mayor Anderson delivered a speech recounting Pine Ridge's founding and growth. Daniel and Emma stood at the edge of the crowd where he could watch the mayor's lips without obstruction. As the speech concluded, the mayor announced, "And now, in celebration of our town's progress, we've planned a special bell-ringing ceremony. This new bell will hang in our recently completed schoolhouse, calling the children of Pine Ridge to education for generations to come." A cloth was pulled away, revealing a gleaming brass bell mounted on a temporary stand. The mayor gestured to the oldest resident of Pine Ridge to do the honors of the first ring. As the bell's clear tone rang out across the square, Emma felt Daniel's hand tighten on hers. She looked up to find his expression transformed with wonder. "I felt it," he signed excitedly. "The vibration through the ground and in the air. I felt the bell's voice." The simple joy in his face moved Emma deeply. In that moment, she understood something profound about Daniel. He didn't dwell on what he couldn't experience, but found wonder in what he could. After the ceremony, they joined the community picnic spread across the town square. They sat with the Perrys, communicating through a mixture of signs, lip reading, and written notes that had become second nature to their growing circle. As they ate, Emma noticed Harold Wilson deep in conversation with several town council members, casting occasional glances in their direction. The intensity of his gaze made her uneasy. The afternoon festivities included children's races, a horseshoe competition, which Daniel entered and won handily, and various exhibits of local crafts and produce. By late afternoon, the celebration shifted toward preparations for the evening dance. Musicians began setting up on the platform, testing their instruments. Lanterns were strung across the square, waiting to be lit at dusk. Couples strolled arm in arm. Ladies in their finest dresses, gentlemen in suits rarely worn on the frontier. Daniel guided Emma to a quiet spot beneath a large pine tree at the edge of the square. His expression had grown serious. "I need to ask you something important," he signed. Emma nodded, her heart quickening at his solemnity. "Your inheritance changes things," he continued. You don't need a husband for security now. You could build any life you want." She started to protest, but he gently stopped her hands. "Let me finish. I want you to stay because you choose me, not because it's your only option. So I'm asking clearly, would you consider becoming my wife? Not today or tomorrow, but when you're certain it's what you want." The directness of his proposal, so typical of Daniel's straightforward nature, brought tears to Emma's eyes. There was no artifice here, no social maneuvering or calculation of advantage. Just a man asking a woman to share his life with all its challenges and joys. Before she could respond, Mayor Anderson's voice boomed from the platform, calling for everyone's attention. "Before we begin our Founders' Day dance, the Town Council has an announcement regarding an exciting development for Pine Ridge." Daniel frowned, unable to hear the announcement. Emma started to translate, but the mayor's next words froze her hands mid-sign. "Mr. Harold Wilson has generously proposed funding a new community project, a home for unfortunates unable to care for themselves due to disability or infirmity." A murmur ran through the crowd as Harold stepped onto the platform, the very picture of benevolent philanthropy. "My friends and neighbors," Harold began, his voice carrying across the square. "Progress means not just economic growth, but also demonstrating our Christian charity toward those less fortunate. I propose establishing the Pine Ridge Asylum for the Disabled, where those suffering from afflictions such as deafness, muteness, and similar conditions can receive proper care." Emma felt Daniel stiffen beside her, his eyes narrowing as he read Harold's lips. "These unfortunates often struggle to maintain independent lives, as we've witnessed in our own community," Harold continued. "The noble attempt of Mr. Cooper to run a ranch despite his limitations, or Miss Mitchell's efforts to support herself despite her vocal affliction, these are admirable but ultimately challenging paths." The calculated cruelty of Harold's announcement, disguised as charity, left Emma breathless with anger. This was his response to their public courtship, an attempt to classify them as pitiable invalids incapable of normal lives. Daniel's face had gone very still, his jaw tight with controlled fury. Without hesitation, he took Emma's hand and led her directly toward the platform, cutting through the crowd with determined strides. Harold faltered mid-sentence as he saw them approach, a flicker of unease crossing his face. Reaching the edge of the platform, Daniel helped Emma up the steps, then followed, standing tall before the assembled townspeople. The crowd fell silent, watching the unexpected interruption with collective held breath. Emma looked out at the faces, some curious, some uncomfortable, some openly hostile, others supportive. This was the moment that would define their future in Pine Ridge. Taking a deep breath, she turned to face Harold Wilson, her chin high, her purpose clear. Standing before the assembled townspeople, Emma felt a lifetime of suppressed words pressing against her throat. For once, she wished for her full voice, but would have to make do with what she had. She turned to Daniel, signing quickly. "May I speak for us?" He nodded, his trust in her evident even amid his anger. Emma faced Harold Wilson, who watched with barely concealed contempt. Drawing a deep breath, she pushed her damaged voice to its limits. "Mr. Wilson," she began, her words raspy but audible in the hushed square, "your concern is misplaced." The crowd murmured in surprise at hearing her speak for the first time. Emma pressed on, each word carefully formed. "We do not need your charity or your asylum." Harold's smile turned patronizing. "Miss Mitchell, your condition clearly affects your judgment. While admirable, your independence and Mr. Cooper's is ultimately unsustainable. My proposal would ensure you both receive proper care." Daniel stepped forward, his expression resolute. He took the small slate that hung from Emma's wrist and wrote in bold strokes, "I run a profitable ranch. I support myself through honest work. I need no charity or asylum." He held the slate up for all to see, his gaze challenging anyone to dispute his words. Mayor Anderson looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Wilson meant no offense, I'm sure. His proposal comes from genuine concern." "No," Emma interrupted, her strained voice carrying surprising authority. "His proposal comes from prejudice, disguised as kindness." Harold's face flushed red. "You forget yourself, Miss Mitchell. You arrived here penniless, rejected as a mail-order bride, taken in through the town's goodwill. And you, Cooper," he turned to Daniel with undisguised disdain, "you may manage that small ranch of yours, but let's not pretend you wouldn't benefit from specialized care." Rachel pushed through the crowd to stand beneath the platform. "That's enough, Harold. Daniel Cooper runs one of the most efficient ranches in the county, and Emma's work has doubled my business." Nathan Perry joined her. "Mr. Cooper taught me more about ranching in one season than my father did in 5 years. He doesn't need anyone's help or pity." Harold's expression hardened. This emotional display doesn't change facts. People with such severe impediments require specialized supervision. The council will vote on my proposal next week. Emma felt Daniel's hand take hers. He stepped forward again, writing quickly on the slate. "I came to this celebration to announce my intention to marry Miss Mitchell with her consent. We are not seeking charity, but respect for our choice to build a life together." A hush fell over the crowd as Daniel's written declaration was passed around. Some faces showed shock, others disapproval, but Emma also noted nods of support and smiles of encouragement from unexpected quarters. Harold scoffed. "A marriage between two people who can barely communicate with normal society. How would you raise children? How would you engage in commerce or civic duties?" Before either could respond, Edward Blackwood stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. As a distinguished visitor from the East, his presence commanded immediate attention. "If I may address this gathering," he began formally, "I've known Miss Mitchell since childhood. She was raised in one of Philadelphia's respected families and received an excellent education. Her vocal condition resulted from an illness that claimed her parents. Despite this tragedy, she maintained their household affairs competently until deciding to seek a new beginning here." He turned to Daniel with newfound respect. "And while I've known Mr. Cooper only briefly, I've observed his intelligence, dignity, and industriousness. In Philadelphia's highest circles, we consider a man's character the measure of his worth, not his physical capabilities." Edward faced Harold directly. "Furthermore, Miss Mitchell has recently inherited a substantial fortune through her father's investments. She chooses to remain in Pine Ridge not from necessity, but from preference for the life and community she's found here. Specifically, her preference for Mr. Cooper's company." Murmurs rippled through the crowd at this revelation. Emma squeezed Daniel's hand in silent gratitude for Edward's unexpected advocacy. Harold looked momentarily disconcerted before recovering. "Money doesn't eliminate their limitations. An asylum would still provide appropriate—" "No," Mayor Anderson interrupted, clearly reassessing the situation in light of Edward's revelations. "I believe we've heard enough, Harold. Your proposal was offered in what you considered the town's best interest, but it appears Miss Mitchell and Mr. Cooper have made their own arrangements." He turned to address the gathering. "This is a celebration of our town's progress. Part of that progress must include recognizing that people overcome challenges in different ways. If Miss Mitchell and Mr. Cooper have found happiness together, despite, or perhaps because of, their unique circumstances, who are we to interfere?" Harold's face darkened with humiliation. "The council vote can wait," the mayor concluded firmly. "For now, I believe we have a dance to commence, and perhaps a courtship to celebrate." He gestured toward Emma and Daniel with a tentative smile. The tension in the square gradually dissolved as the musicians struck up a lively tune, signaling a return to the planned festivities. Harold Wilson stormed off the platform, pushing through the crowd without meeting anyone's eyes. Emma felt a momentary pang of sympathy for him, a man so consumed by propriety and appearance that he couldn't recognize the humanity in difference. As people began to pair up for dancing, Emma and Daniel remained on the platform, suddenly uncertain. Edward approached, offering a formal bow to them both. "I hope I didn't overstep," he said, "but I couldn't stand by while that man disguised his prejudice as concern." Emma signed her thanks, which Daniel translated aloud in his rarely used voice for Edward's benefit. "She is grateful, as am I." Edward nodded. "I'll be leaving tomorrow, Emma. Your father would be proud of the life you're building here. Different from what he might have imagined, but no less worthy." He extended his hand to Daniel. "Take care of her, Mr. Cooper, though I suspect she's equally capable of taking care of you." After Edward departed, Daniel and Emma descended from the platform into a community transformed. People who had previously avoided them now approached with tentative greetings. Some attempted clumsy signs they'd clearly just learned from Nathan or Rachel. Others simply nodded with newfound respect. As lanterns were lit across the square and twilight settled over Pine Ridge, Daniel turned to Emma with a question in his eyes. He signed, "Dance with me?" She hesitated. "You can dance?" A smile tugged at his lips. "Mother taught me the steps. Said I didn't need to hear music to move with grace." He led her to the edge of the dance floor where the vibrations from the musicians' instruments were strongest. Placing her hand on his shoulder, he took her waist gently, guiding her into a simple waltz. What they lacked in precision, they made up for in connection. Daniel counted the rhythm in his head, his steps sure and steady. Emma followed his lead, marveling at this new dimension of the man she'd come to love. They weren't the most accomplished dancers in Pine Ridge that night, but they were perhaps the most watched, not with the previous stares of curiosity or pity, but with a dawning recognition that love and determination could overcome boundaries most considered insurmountable. As the evening drew to a close, Daniel escorted Emma back to Clara's boarding house. On the porch, shielded from curious eyes by the gathering darkness, he signed, "You never answered my question from earlier." Emma tilted her head questioningly. "About becoming my wife," he clarified, before Harold's announcement. The events of the day had nearly pushed his proposal from her mind. Now, in the quiet aftermath of their public stand, the question returned with even greater significance. She didn't hesitate, her hands forming the signs with certainty. "Yes, I would be honored to marry you." Daniel's smile illuminated his face, joy radiating from him like heat from a flame. From his pocket, he withdrew a small worn box. Inside, nestled a ring of simple design, a gold band with a small sapphire. "My mother's," he explained, "kept it safe for when I found someone to love." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Emma felt the weight of history and promise. It represented not just Daniel's family legacy, but the future they would build together, bridging worlds and limitations that others considered defining. When Clara opened the door, having watched through the window with poorly disguised interest, her eyes immediately went to the ring. "Well," she said, a smile warming her face, "it seems congratulations are in order." News of their engagement spread through Pine Ridge with remarkable speed. By the following morning, Rachel greeted Emma with an enthusiastic hug when she arrived at the shop. "I knew it! I told Clara just last week that you two would make it official before winter's end." Emma smiled, her hands moving in the signs Rachel had learned. "We haven't set a date yet." "Well, whenever it is, you'll need a proper wedding. A dress, and don't think of paying for it. Consider it my gift." Throughout the day, customers offered congratulations with varying degrees of sincerity. Some were genuinely pleased. Others clearly still processing the unusual match. Mrs. Jenkins, the banker's wife, paused while collecting her newly altered cloak. "I admit I didn't understand at first," she said carefully. "But watching you two at the dance, there's something special in how you communicate, something many married couples never achieve despite having all their faculties." Emma nodded, grateful for the woman's honesty and growing acceptance. Not everyone was supportive. Harold Wilson's wife entered the shop with barely concealed disdain, requesting alterations to a dress while pointedly avoiding Emma's assistance. And the Reverend's wife made a comment within Emma's hearing about the Lord's mysterious ways in matching the afflicted. But these voices were increasingly in the minority. Something had shifted in Pine Ridge's perception, a widening of possibilities for what constituted a worthy life and partnership. 3 days after the Founders' Day celebration, Daniel arrived at the shop near closing time. His expression was unusually serious as he waited for Rachel to step into the back room before approaching Emma. "We need to talk," he signed. "Can you come to the ranch this Sunday?" Concern fluttered in Emma's chest. "Is something wrong?" Daniel hesitated. "Not wrong. Important. About our future." Throughout the week, Emma's mind conjured various scenarios. Had Daniel reconsidered their engagement? Was there some aspect of ranch life he feared she couldn't adapt to? By Sunday morning, her nerves were stretched tight as she waited for Nathan Perry to collect her in the wagon. To her surprise, Daniel himself arrived, looking exceptionally handsome in clean work clothes, his expression a mixture of nervousness and excitement. The ride to the ranch passed in companionable silence, though Emma noticed Daniel casting frequent glances her way, as if reassuring himself of her presence. When they arrived, another surprise awaited. The Perrys were there, along with Rachel and Clara, all wearing their Sunday best. "What's happening?" Emma signed to Daniel, confusion evident in her face. He took her hands in his. "And I realized something after Founders' Day. We don't need to wait or plan an elaborate wedding. If you're certain, if you're ready." Understanding dawned slowly. "Today," she signed, her eyes widening. Daniel nodded. "Reverend Phillips is waiting inside. But only if you want this. We can wait if you prefer a proper ceremony in town." Emma glanced at the assembled friends, their faces bearing expressions of happy anticipation. Clara had brought a small valise, presumably containing Emma's things, indicating her collaboration in this surprise. For a moment, Emma considered all that a traditional wedding would entail. The preparations, the church ceremony, the unavoidable whispers and stares from those in town who still viewed their union with skepticism. Then she looked at Daniel's face, open, honest, loving, and the home he had built ready to share with her. "No waiting," she signed decisively. "Today is perfect." Relief and joy transformed Daniel's features. He gestured toward the house, but before they could move, Emma held up one finger, asking him to wait. She turned to Clara. "Could I have a few minutes to prepare?" she asked in her raspy voice, wanting this moment to be special despite its spontaneity. Clara beamed. "Of course, dear. Rachel and I brought everything you might need. Come along." In the guest bedroom, Emma found a simple but beautiful ivory dress laid out on the bed, not an elaborate wedding gown, but a lovely alternative clearly made with care over the past week. "We estimated your measurements from the dresses you've altered," Rachel explained as she helped Emma change. "Daniel approached me the day after Founders' Day with this plan, said he didn't want to wait, didn't see the point in elaborate ceremonies, when what mattered was building your life together." Clara arranged Emma's hair with dried lavender and winter holly that Daniel had gathered that morning. "That man adores you," she said, meeting Emma's eyes in the small mirror. "You know that, don't you?" Emma nodded, emotion tightening her throat. "It won't be easy," Clara continued. "No marriage is. but you two understand struggle in ways most couples never will. That's a strength, not a weakness. When they emerged from the bedroom, the main room had been transformed. Fresh pine boughs adorned every surface, and the afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the small gathering. Reverend Phillips stood before the fireplace, his Bible open in his hands, and there was Daniel, waiting by the hearth, his expression transforming as Emma appeared. The naked adoration in his eyes would have brought her to tears if she hadn't been so filled with joy. The ceremony was brief and unconventional. Daniel had written his vows, which he handed to Reverend Phillips to read aloud, while simultaneously signing the words to Emma. I promise to build a life of equal partnership where our differences complement rather than divide us. I promise to see your silence not as an absence, but as a space where understanding deepens. I promise to face the world's judgment with you, never forgetting that what others perceive as our greatest weaknesses have led to our greatest strength, each other. Emma's vows were signed directly to Daniel, with Clara softly voicing the translation for the others. I promise to be your ears when needed, your voice when wanted, but never to define you by what you cannot hear or me by what I cannot say. I promise to create a home where communication flows not from lips and ears alone, but from heart to heart. I promise to stand beside you in dignity and determination, grateful each day for the silence that brought us together. When Reverend Phillips pronounced them husband and wife, Daniel took Emma's face gently between his hands, his eyes conveying devotion words could never adequately express. Their kiss was both a seal upon their vows and a declaration to the world. They had found in each other's so-called limitations a freedom most would never know. The small celebration afterward was filled with laughter and conversation flowing in multiple forms. Spoken words, signed exchanges, written notes, and the universal language of smiles and embraces. Mrs. Perry had prepared a feast, and Nathan produced a fiddle, playing lively tunes that vibrated through the floorboards, while his father attempted to teach Daniel and Emma a folk dance that dissolved into good-natured laughter. As twilight settled over the ranch, the guests departed with hugs and well wishes, leaving the newlyweds alone in what was now their shared home. The reality of the day's events seemed to settle over them both as the door closed behind Clara, the last to leave. Wife, Daniel signed, the word carrying wonder. Husband, Emma replied, equally amazed by the transformation a few hours had wrought. He took her hands, his expression growing serious. Are you happy with this, our small wedding, this modest house? Emma looked around at the ranch house that had so impressed her on her first visit. The bookshelves filled with worlds of knowledge, the clockwork bench speaking to Daniel's precision and patience, the solid walls built by generations of Coopermen. Then she looked at Daniel himself, the man who had seen her silence not as a barrier, but as a kindred spirit to his own silent world. This isn't a modest house, she signed, her movements eloquent with emotion. It's the richest home I've ever known. Later that night, as they stood on the porch watching the stars emerge in the vast Colorado sky, Daniel wrapped his arms around Emma from behind, his chin resting on her head. In the distance, wolves called to each other across the darkened hills. Sounds she could hear, but he could only imagine. Yet they stood in the same moment, under the same stars, their hearts beating to rhythms neither could actually hear, but both could feel. Different perceptions of the same world, complementary rather, than divisive. Emma turned in his embrace to face him, her hands rising between them to sign words no one else would witness. In Philadelphia, I was defined by what I'd lost. Here with you, I'm defined by what I've found. Daniel's answering smile held the promise of all their tomorrows, days built not on perfect hearing or perfect speech, but on perfect understanding. They had found in each other's silence the most eloquent language of all: acceptance without condition, love without reservation, and the quiet miracle of being truly seen. In a world that valued noise and conformity, they had created a sanctuary of meaningful silence and authentic connection, proving that sometimes the most powerful expressions of love require no sound at all. Spring arrived early that year, painting the hills around Pine Ridge with wildflowers and tender green grass. Emma stood on the porch of their expanded ranch house, watching Daniel demonstrate proper fence-mending techniques to two young men from town, apprentices of sorts who had approached Daniel after hearing of his innovative ranching methods. In the 4 months since their wedding, subtle changes had transformed the Cooper property. Emma had planted an herb garden beside the kitchen and established a small workshop in the converted storage room where she continued her seamstress work. For special clients who didn't mind traveling outside town for her skillful needle. Inside, her feminine touches blended seamlessly with Daniel's practical furnishings: embroidered cushions on wooden chairs, curtains that softened the windows while still allowing the spectacular mountain light to flood the rooms. It wasn't grand, but it was undeniably a home, warmed by shared purpose and mutual respect. The biggest change, however, had come in the town's attitude. What had begun as grudging acceptance after Founders' Day had evolved into genuine integration. Several Pine Ridge residents had made efforts to learn basic sign language, discovering its practical applications in situations where spoken words were inefficient or impossible, across noisy sawmills, during church socials, or in hunting parties, where silence was necessary. Daniel's clock repair business had flourished, with customers now coming directly to the ranch rather than leaving items with Rachel to forward. And Emma, to her surprise, had been invited to join the Ladies' Aid Society, where her organizational skills earned respect regardless of her limited speech. From the hillside came the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Emma shaded her eyes against the morning sun to see Nathan Perry riding toward the house, his horse at a canter, his expression serious. Something important then. Daniel noticed her attention shift and glanced up from his demonstration. Seeing Nathan, he signed briefly to his students before walking to join Emma on the porch. "What is it?" she signed, when Nathan was close enough to see her hands. Nathan dismounted quickly. "Sheriff Tanner asked me to fetch you both," he said, his voice and signs simultaneous, a skill he'd developed from spending so much time with them. "There's a situation in town you should know about." Daniel's posture tensed. "Problem? Harold Wilson collapsed at the Mercantile this morning," Nathan explained. "Dr. Simmons says it's his heart. They don't think he'll last the day." Emma exchanged a quick glance with Daniel. Their relationship with Harold had remained strained, despite the gradual acceptance from the rest of the community. After his veiled asylum proposal, he had retreated into bitter isolation, refusing to stock items Daniel requested and ignoring Emma completely when they passed on the street. "Why call us?" Daniel signed, his expression questioning. "He's been asking for you both," Nathan replied. "Won't settle until he sees you. Mrs. Wilson is beside herself." Daniel turned to Emma, his eyebrows raised in silent question. Though neither spoke the words aloud, both were thinking the same thing. After months of animosity, why would Harold Wilson want them at his deathbed? "We'll come," Emma decided, signing and whispering simultaneously. The ride to town was tense with speculation. What could Harold possibly want from them? Forgiveness? A final opportunity to express his disapproval? Or perhaps most troubling of all, a deathbed request they might find impossible to grant? Pine Ridge seemed unusually quiet as they rode down the main street. Several townspeople nodded solemnly as they passed, the news of Harold's condition having spread quickly. They found Mrs. Wilson sitting rigidly in her parlor, her face pale but composed. She rose when they entered, her usual disdain muted by circumstance. "He's upstairs," she said stiffly. The doctor says it won't be long." As they climbed the stairs, Emma felt Daniel's hand seek hers, a brief squeeze conveying strength and solidarity. Whatever awaited them in Harold's bedroom, they would face it together. The merchant lay propped against pillows, his robust frame now diminished, his skin ashen. Dr. Simmons stood at his bedside, checking his pulse, but stepped back as they entered. "They're here, Harold," the doctor said clearly, allowing him to read his lips. Harold's eyes, the only part of him that retained their former vigor, fixed on the couple. He gestured weakly toward the bedside table where paper and pencil lay ready. With obvious effort, he wrote, "Need to speak with you alone." The doctor hesitated, then nodded. 5 minutes, he cautioned before leaving the room. When the door closed, Harold's hand shook as he wrote again, "I was wrong." The simple declaration hung between them, unexpected and powerful. Emma felt Daniel's surprise mirror her own. Harold continued writing, each word clearly costing him precious energy. "Saw you two last week, at church social, watching how you communicated, how others have learned from you." He paused, gathering strength, then added, "My stubbornness blinded me. You've made our town better, not worse." Emma's throat tightened with emotion. She touched Daniel's arm to draw his attention, then signed, "We all have our limitations. Some are just more visible than others." Daniel nodded, then took the pencil and paper from Harold's weakening grasp. In his precise handwriting, he responded, "Thank you for telling us. Peace between us would be welcome." A ghost of a smile touched Harold's lips. He wrote one final message. "The Asylum Fund, nearly $300 collected. I'm leaving instructions. It should go to you both. Use it for something that truly helps." Before either could respond, Harold's eyes drifted closed, his breathing becoming more labored. Daniel reached for the bell to summon the doctor, while Emma impulsively took Harold's hand in hers. His fingers twitched slightly, acknowledging her touch. Mrs. Wilson and the doctor returned quickly. As they stepped back to give them room, Emma and Daniel shared a glance laden with complex emotions. Relief at the reconciliation, sorrow for the family's impending loss, and contemplation of the unexpected responsibility now placed upon them. They remained at the Wilson home until sunset, when Harold slipped away peacefully. Though not asked to stay, something compelled them to bear witness to this final chapter in their complicated relationship with the man. Perhaps it was the recognition that Harold's journey, from rejection to reluctant acceptance to final understanding, mirrored, in some ways, the town's evolution. On the ride home under a canopy of emerging stars, they discussed Harold's parting gift and what it might become. "Not an asylum," Emma signed emphatically. "No," Daniel agreed. "Something that embraces differences, rather than segregating them." As the ranch came into view, its windows glowing with welcoming lamplight, an idea began to take shape between them. Not fully formed yet, but alive with possibility. Something that would honor Harold's final insight, while transforming his original misguided impulse into a force for genuine inclusion. 10 years had transformed Pine Ridge beyond recognition. What had once been a frontier outpost now boasted a railway station, 3 hotels, and a main street lined with gas lamps. The mountain town had grown in population and prosperity, but its most remarkable evolution wasn't visible in buildings or businesses. Emma Cooper stood on the steps of the Pine Ridge School for Practical Communication, watching children pour from its doors at day's end. The 2-story brick building, constructed 5 years earlier with funds that had begun with Harold Wilson's unexpected bequest, now served nearly 60 students from throughout the region. At 40, Emma's auburn hair now contained strands of silver, but her posture remained straight, her eyes clear and observant. She smiled as she spotted her daughter Charlotte weaving through the crowd, her hands moving in animated conversation with 2 friends. At 9, Charlotte Cooper had her father's expressive eyes and her mother's determined spirit. Born with perfect hearing, she moved effortlessly between the silent and speaking worlds, as comfortable with sign language as with spoken words. Behind her came 7-year-old Thomas, whose deafness had been discovered shortly after birth. Unlike his father's generation, Thomas had never known isolation. From infancy, he had been surrounded by a community where his difference was accommodated rather than pitied. "Mother," Charlotte called, rushing forward. "Miss Reynolds says my essay on territorial history is the best she's ever read." Her hands signed the words simultaneously with her speech, a habit most Pine Ridge children now developed naturally. Emma embraced her daughter, then knelt to receive Thomas's enthusiastic greeting. "Father at home," he signed, his movements quick and precise. "Yes," Emma replied, finishing the new irrigation system with Mr. Perry. The Cooper Ranch had doubled in size over the years, becoming a model of innovation that drew visitors from as far as Denver. Daniel's methods for raising drought-resistant cattle were now being adopted throughout Colorado, and the clockmaking workshop he'd established employed 3 deaf apprentices from neighboring communities. As they walked home, Emma reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The school had been just the beginning, a place where deaf and hearing children learned side by side, where sign language was taught alongside traditional subjects. From that foundation had grown a community where difference was viewed as variation rather than deficit. Rachel Green waved from her expanded shop, where she now supervised 5 seamstresses, including 2 young deaf women whose intricate beadwork had become sought after throughout the territory. Clara Thompson, now in her 70s but still sharp-minded, sat on her porch greeting passers-by in both spoken and signed language. Even the church had evolved, with services conducted simultaneously in speech and sign, and Reverend Phillips now famous for sermons that incorporated the poetic visual elements of signed expression. The transformation hadn't been without struggle. Some families had left town rather than accept the changes. Others had resisted initially, before gradually recognizing the practical advantages of a community with multiple forms of communication. Mrs. Wilson had been among the most surprising converts. After her husband's death, she had immersed herself in learning sign language, eventually becoming one of the school's most dedicated volunteers. Harold would have come around completely, given time, she often said. He just needed to see the possibilities. As they crested the hill, the Cooper Ranch came into view. The original house now expanded with a dedicated classroom wing where Emma taught advanced sewing techniques 3 days a week. In the south field, Daniel worked alongside Nathan Perry, both men now in their 40s, their movements displaying the easy coordination of long partnership. Daniel looked up, somehow sensing their presence despite the distance. He waved broadly, then signed to Nathan before jogging toward his family. Thomas ran to meet him halfway, launching into an excited account of his school day through flying. Fingers. Emma watched her husband's face as he knelt to give their son his full attention, the same intensity of focus, the same respect for communication that had drawn her to him from their first meeting in Rachel's shop. In the decades since their marriage, Daniel's position in the community had evolved from tolerated outsider to respected leader. He served on the town council, his insights sought on matters far beyond the disability accommodations that had once defined him. Last year, the territorial governor had appointed him to a commission developing educational standards for all Colorado schools. "You're thinking deep thoughts," Daniel signed as he approached, Thomas now perched on his shoulders. "Remembering," Emma replied, her hands forming the words as naturally as breath. "The day Harold rejected me at the station, how lost I felt." Daniel's expression softened. He set Thomas down and signed, "The best wrong turn you ever took." That evening, as darkness settled over the ranch and their children slept, Emma and Yi Daniel sat on their expanded porch, a quilt wrapped around their shoulders against the spring chill. From town came the faint sound of the train whistle, the evening express from Denver. "Do you ever wonder?" Daniel signed, his hands illuminated by lamplight spilling through the window. "If you'd been able to speak normally, if Harold had accepted you that day?" Emma shook her head firmly. "I would have lived half a life, one where I was valued for appearances rather than substance." She looked out at the ranch they had built together, at the school visible on the town's edge, at the community that had learned to see ability in new forms. Then she turned back to her husband, her hands expressing what her limited voice never could. "Being rejected for my silence led me to the one person who could truly hear me." Daniel's smile held all the warmth of their shared years as he signed in response. "And your willingness to enter my silence taught me I had never truly been alone." They sat together as the stars emerged above the Colorado mountains, two people whose perceived limitations had become the foundation for a connection few would ever know, and for a community transformed by the understanding that sometimes the most profound communication requires no sound at all. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.